All right, welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're essentially opening up a massive historical cold case. We are going to investigate one of the most famous, foundational narratives in all of human history, the story of the Exodus. By diving into a really fascinating analysis of archaeological data and textual scholarship provided by our source material, we're going to look closely at the evidence, or actually the glaring lack of evidence, surrounding this entire epic tale. It's a pretty staggering question to ask, right? I mean, we're all familiar with the story. Moses stands before Pharaoh, the seas split wide open, plagues rain down from the sky, and this massive nation of enslaved people walks out of Egypt in total triumph. But the core premise of the analysis we're exploring today suggests something completely different. It argues that the biblical story of Moses and the Exodus is actually a carefully crafted political myth, not an objective historical fact. So let's look at the evidence the source presents to back up this huge claim. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The Silence of Egypt. To investigate an event of this magnitude, we've got to start exactly where the legend itself begins: ancient Egypt. And what we find in the records of this incredibly meticulous empire is our first major piece of evidence: 2 million. The biblical text claims that roughly 2 million slaves left Egypt overnight. Just think about the logistical magnitude of that claim for a second. An exodus of that sheer size should have left a massive, undeniable historical footprint. We are talking about literal mountains of evidence: traces in ruins, records carved into temples, frantic references in papyrus scrolls. But when we look at the archaeological record, it tells a completely different story. The source highlights this super stark contrast between the text and reality. On one side, you have the biblical claim, 10 devastating plagues, an entire Egyptian army completely swallowed by the sea, and a sudden catastrophic labor drain. But on the other side, the actual physical archaeological findings from that specific era show a flourishing, highly stable Egyptian empire. The bureaucracy was fully intact, the grain stores were completely uninterrupted, and there is absolutely zero record of a catastrophic collapse or a massive slave rebellion. The source beautifully distills this whole problem with this powerful quote: "Silence is not evidence of conspiracy. Silence is evidence of absence." You know, the ancient Egyptians were absolutely obsessed with record keeping. I mean, they documented everything: tax receipts, grain storage, minor border skirmishes, even the names of individual slaves. According to the analysis, it is historically implausible, literally impossible to believe that they would just somehow forget to document the greatest slave rebellion in human history. The absence of evidence here is just deafening. Moving on, Section 2, Searching the Sinai Desert. So, let's move our investigation out from the borders of Egypt and into the harsh, completely barren landscape of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, this area has been heavily excavated by archaeologists for decades, and the biblical text claims that these millions of Israelites didn't just casually cross this desert. They wandered this specific contained geographical area for 40 long years. And yet, the physical evidence for this multi-decade encampment is just entirely missing. We're talking about zero human remains, no discarded weapons, no broken pottery, no traces of massive ancient campsites, nothing. The source points out this incredible irony here. Archaeologists have easily found the subtle traces of tiny scattered nomadic tribes that lived in the Sinai during the exact same period. Yet there is absolutely zero physical trace of an encampment that supposedly held millions of people for 4 whole decades. And this brilliantly illustrates another major historical discrepancy the source points out: textual anachronisms. Basically, the timeline just doesn't match the archaeology at all. The biblical story says the Hebrew slaves built the cities of Pithom and Ramses, while excavations reveal those cities were actually constructed centuries after the supposed Exodus. And what about the famous walls of Jericho coming tumbling down? The archaeological record shows Jericho wasn't even a standing city during the time frame the Bible places the Exodus. Its walls had been destroyed centuries earlier. So, if the Exodus didn't happen as a literal historical event, well, it forces us to pivot. We have to ask a much deeper question. Why invent a story like this? What were the psychological or even the political motives behind crafting such an epic narrative? Which brings us to Section 3, the political motive. To understand the why, we really have to look at the when and where. The source guides us to the late kingdom of Judah, which is a completely different historical context from the supposed time of Moses. The analysis suggests that this story was actually crafted hundreds of years later by priests and scribes living in a struggling minor state. They were a shattered nation. They were surrounded by massive, threatening empires. They needed an unbreakable identity to survive. And what better way to unify a bunch of disparate tribes than to invent a past where they were the chosen people rescued by a divine hand that literally crushed the mightiest empire on earth? The source argues that the Exodus wasn't about recording historical truth. It was about generating power and forging a shared divine destiny.
Okay, Section 4. Who wrote the Torah?
If we accept this political motive, we absolutely have to question the traditional authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, which tradition says was written by Moses himself. This brings us to a really critical concept in biblical scholarship called the documentary hypothesis. This is the widely accepted theory that the Torah is definitely not the work of a single author. Instead, it's a composite patchwork. It's like a giant puzzle stitched together from multiple sources, written centuries apart, and primarily compiled by anonymous scribes during and after the Babylonian exile. Scholars generally identify 4 distinct textual sources here, often referred to as J, E, D, and P. When researchers pull the text apart, they find vastly different styles, different vocabularies, and even totally distinct theologies. For example, the J source portrays a God who literally walks and talks directly with humans, but the E source, that one envisions a much more distant, majestic deity. These distinct and, honestly, often competing traditions were clumsily merged into a single national narrative by much later editors. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the merging of those different sources left behind obvious fingerprints of fabrication. Because it was an editorial patchwork, the final text is just full of glaring contradictions. We get 2 separate creation stories, 2 different flood accounts, and directly contradictory numbers and timelines about the Exodus itself. One single author wouldn't write these contradictions. The source argues that these are the literal marks left behind by different storytellers weaving and rewriting the text over centuries. Let's look at the fallout in Section 5, the domino effect. If we accept the source's conclusion that the Exodus is strictly an invented myth, well, we have to examine the massive cascading theological fallout. It creates a pretty powerful domino effect. Let's walk through this sequential collapse exactly as outlined by the source. First, if the Exodus is proven as a myth, the first domino falls. Second, the entire concept of a chosen people suddenly loses its historical basis. Third, without an actual Exodus, the sacred covenant made at Sinai lacks a physical origin. And finally, the messianic prophecies that completely rely on this lineage lose their foundational anchor. Removing the historical Exodus destabilizes the entire religious structure built right on top of it. And, this analysis extends to Christianity as well. The source neutrally points out how early Christianity basically supercharged the Exodus myth. While Christian tradition frames Jesus as the new Moses and the Last Supper as a fulfillment of the Passover liberation, the source notes a tough reality. If Moses never actually existed, this historical reality makes the prophetic weight of Jesus' mission and the deep symbolism of the Last Supper kind of hollow, because it's rooted in an invention. The source also addresses the darker, real-world consequences of this text. It argues that this wasn't just some innocent story of community identity. It was weaponized. Once you invent a narrative of chosenness, you inherently create a mandate of exclusion. This myth was actively used to justify the brutal conquest of Canaan, to declare wars, and to seize occupied lands, all under the guise of a divine will. Which leads us to a pretty stark conclusion drawn by the source. Religious truth is created, not found, shaped, crafted, rewritten, reinforced, and ultimately weaponized. It really forces the reader to look behind the curtain at the human machinery, the multiple authors, and the sheer political agendas hiding behind texts we were always told were sacred and completely untouchable. And that leaves us with this final, provocative thought to consider today. If faith is no longer rigidly bound to the literal history of a mythic figure like Moses, what does that actually mean for us today? Well, the source suggests that this realization doesn't have to be just devastating. It can actually be incredibly liberating. It challenges us to ask, might discarding our blind obedience to a historical myth actually open the door to deeper empathy, to genuine curiosity, and to a way more open-hearted dialogue with one another? It's a huge, fascinating question to leave you with. Thanks so much for joining me for today's Explainer, and hey, keep questioning the story.